Dear YouTube, today I'd like to talk about Japanese guitar history, and more specifically about a brand and a factory that has changed the way that we build guitars today. Guitars from this factory have an almost mythical reputation among guitarists and bass players. Before we start, I would love to hear from you if you have any stories about Japanese guitars. Let me know in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Let me take you back to a different era.
この番組はご覧のスポンサーの提供でお送りします。
This story starts in Nagoya, Japan, in the years after World War II. The Americans had occupied the country and were putting through economic and military reforms. Shiro Arai was hanging out at home with a friend who had brought a classical guitar. Arai was expecting him to play some Japanese koto music, but instead he was playing a piece by Bach. Arai instantly fell in love with the instrument and the sound. The next day, he bought himself a classical guitar for about 2 months' worth of salary. He became obsessed with the instrument, played night and day, and became an apprentice at a famous guitar teacher in Nagoya. Fast forward to 1953 in post-occupation Japan. Arai and 2 colleagues had quit their day job and started their own company. They went bankrupt within a year, and Arai ended up on the streets with only his guitar left. To survive and pay off his debt, he began teaching guitar. He began a lucrative side hustle. In Japanese music stores, it was almost impossible to buy good quality guitars and accessories like sheet music and strings. Arai began importing guitars from famous luthiers like Jose Ramirez and Hermann Hauser for both himself and his students. The demand increased, however, from friends and guitar players through all of Japan. Arai saw an opportunity, and on November 2nd, 1956, he started his own company. A few years later, around the turn of the decade, Japan saw quite a boom in instrument and guitar builders. Rockabilly and the Beatles were soaring around the world, and the demand for guitars increased. Manufacturers like Fujigen, Taisco and Kawai were setting up shop and building guitars. Many of them had quite the extraordinary designs, especially Taisco with their funky shapes and the gold foil pickups. Just like several other companies, Arai started selling and exporting guitars from several manufacturers. He started putting his name on them, and later he started putting Aria on the headstock. The exact moment and reason are a bit unclear, but one of the reasons I came across was because the American market had a bit trouble of pronouncing Arai correctly. The quality of certain factories improved, and the export to Southeast Asia was increasing as well. The export to the US market, however, wasn't quite a success yet. In November 1962, Arai traveled to the United States. It was there that he learned that Japanese guitars were thought of as junk at the time. He came up with a plan and brought 2 guitars with him on his next trip, built by luthier Masaru Kono, who had studied building guitars in Spain a few years earlier. He went around the country visiting wholesalers to demo the guitars. Usually they refused and weren't interested in him. However, when he took out the guitars and started playing them, the wholesalers were actually quite surprised, and Arai was able to tell and sell his story. However, after a couple of months of traveling through the United States, the guitars would show some signs of warping and tearing. He brought back the guitars to Japan to address these issues. Arai used several factories. 2 of them were for classical guitars and mid-range or specialty guitars at the time. For electric guitars and basses, however, he decided to switch manufacturers. Halfway the 60s, they stopped producing guitars at Gaiatone and switched manufacturers to Matsumoku, a relationship that would grow for years. Matsumoku became a factory of quite a legendary status for their quality. Matsumoku was founded in 1951 as Matsumoto Moko in Nagano. It was a family-owned business that specialized in Tansu cabinets and butsudan. They became a subsidiary of the American Singer Corporation and started building cabinets for their sewing machines as well as hi-fi and TV units. In 1963, when the production of Singer had moved from Japan to the Philippines, they had to switch their production in order to survive. They already had a couple of luthiers as employees, and so they dipped their toes in creating their first guitars and violins. Arai addressed the issues with Matsumoku early on in the process. Their solution was to use wood that had been dried for at least 2 years, use stronger glues, use longer clamp times, and use one feature that would remain throughout the factory's production, using a 3-piece maple neck. During the 60s, Matsumoku and Arai grew a fantastic working relationship. They made solid body guitars like the Aria 1532T and hollow body guitars like the Aria Diamond 1202 that were quite popular in Japan at the time. The factory had employed excellent engineers, designers, and craftsmen. One of them was Norikatsu Arayama, who was the chief engineer during the 1960s. He was a master craftsman, also known for being responsible for producing guitar bodies and necks for companies like ESP, Kramer, and Schecter. We've now arrived in the 1970s in Japan. The society had urbanized and changed quite a bit. Where 40% of the laborers worked in agriculture around 1955, in the 70s there was just 17%. A third of the workforce worked in heavy industries and almost 50% worked in lighter industries. Japan had become the third economy in the world, behind the US and the Soviet Union. The shift to heavy industry, automation and machinery could be seen in the guitar world as well. Matsumoku changed the name to Matsumoku, and as one of the first guitar factories, they started using CNC machines. Even though 60% of the manufacturing process was still done by hand, the combination with automation had led to increased economies of scale, resulting in lower cost prices and higher efficiency and higher consistency and quality. The higher skilled employees could now focus on the details of the instrument instead of the easier labor-intensive work. Competitors like Fujigen didn't switch to those machines until almost a decade later. Matsumoku produced guitars and guitar parts for brands like Vox, Epiphone, Greco, Ibanez, and Yamaha. This was also the decade that became later known as the lawsuit era, which is a complete subject on its own, but it had mostly to do with the Hoshino factory being sued over using the open book headstocks.
We want you to know that you've been warned. We're looking out. We want you to know that you've been warned. We're looking out.
Between 73 and 75, Arai opened marketing offices in West Germany, Hong Kong, Osaka, and Tokyo. Popular brands like Fender and Gibson saw their revenues plummet because of the cheaper and well-designed instruments built from overseas. In 1975, Nobuaki Hayashi was promoted to chief designer of the Matsumoku factory. He had worked as a guitar designer at the factory during the 1960s and had learned the art of carpentry from Norikatsu Harayama. They started producing a higher-end line of electric guitars and basses called Aria Pro II. Many of his designs had designed and approved by H. Noble printed on the headstock, and many of them had features like phase switching and exotic woods. In 1976, Hayashi's own design, the prototype line, was manufactured. The PE 1500, the top-of-the-line guitar, was built as a tribute to Stradivarius. The guitar had a lot of features that would be found decades later on other brands and models. Examples are the heelless neck and the carved arch back with great access to all 22 frets. The crazy attention to detail can be found back in the transition from the neck to the body, the solid wood cover plate of the control cavity, and the wooden inlays from the volume and tone knobs. The guitar also had an Aria-designed Supermatic bridge and came factory fitted with DiMarzio Supra distortion humbuckers. This guitar was proof to the US market that Japan made not only affordable gear, but incredibly high-end gear as well. It was a rather expensive model at the time, and Arai decided to extend the line with cheaper models like the PE 1000, PE 800 and PE 600. Later in 1978, Aria Pro II released their SB1000 bass, which became a big success as well. In 1979, Arai branched out with offices to Los Angeles, which was argued to be the capital of the music industry at the time. According to their 79 catalog,
我が輩は猫である。名前はまだない。どこで生まれたか、とんとん見当がつかぬ。何でも薄暗いジメジメしたところでニャーニャー泣いていたことだけは記憶している。我が輩はここで初めて人間というものを見た。
Okay, even though that wasn't really what was being said, they did boast quite a bit about the confidence in their products and their complete openness to suggestions that helped them grow into the most innovative and fastest growing company in the world. My dad bought a PE 1500 in 1984 after working all summer long and trading in an Aria Pro TS400. The guitar you see in the demos is his guitar. The guitar is truly a work of art and a blasting rock beast. It weighs in at around 4.5 kilograms. In 1986, the home sewing machine industry was in heavy decline and Singer was almost bankrupt. Matsumoku, still being a subsidiary of Singer, could not afford to buy itself out and in 1987 closed down. With the closing of the factory, the fantastic synergy and collaboration between Matsumoku and Arai came to an end. Aria and Aria Pro II guitars are still being made today, albeit in Korea and China, both countries with an interesting history in guitar making as well. The 1970s and 80s were a truly remarkable period in Japanese guitar history. Parallel to Matsumoku, there were a lot of great other factories as well, like Dyna, Fujigen and Kanda Shokai. I haven't even touched upon the many stories about these factories. Fujigen, for example, was for a brief period during the 1980s the only factory in the world producing Fender guitars, while Tokai was responsible for recreating pre-CBS Fenders even years before Fender started reissuing them. Japan, its guitars, brands and factories have an abundance of myths and stories around them. It's a true rabbit hole to dive deep into and will make you want to have one of these instruments that never cease to amaze and have helped set the standard for guitar manufacturing and innovation all around the world.
この動画が気に入ったらぜひいいねしてください。
If you like this story, please consider subscribing to my channel and liking this video. I feel honored every time I see a subscriber or a like, and I try my best to keep up with the comment section. See you next time.